Hi everyone! So congratulations on finishing up the final draft of your literature review. We're going to be moving into our next assignment, the research funding proposal, or what I'll refer to from here on out as the RFP. The RFP is intended to build off of the research and research practices that you've just completed, and is going to propose a research question and design that will hopefully convince people to give you some money. Today's lecture will go over the basic idea of a grant proposal or an RFP, how granting agencies are going to be approaching your proposal, and what it will mean to collaborate as a group on this project. So before we move into what a grant proposal is, its audience, and its goals, I want to give you a little bit of context for how the grant proposal fits into the larger ecology of production of scientific knowledge. On this slide, I've provided Birkenkotter and Huckin's life cycle diagram of how knowledge gets produced through scientific publication. On one side, you have published papers, which follow their own life cycle based on the process of peer review. On the other, you have grant proposals, which are also validated through peer review. Note that the grant proposal side of things is quite simple. The grant is either accepted or rejected, and feeds back into the further production of scientific knowledge through laboratory activity. Where publication and grants overlap is through this last box down here, publications. Note that the production of knowledge in the laboratory feeds into the publication of that knowledge through scholarly journals, which serves as the basis for a grant proposal, which, if accepted, then helps further produce laboratory knowledge, which will result in more publications. In other words, grants are integral to the production and publication of new scholarly knowledge. That's your goal in proposing a project for a grant, a feasible research agenda that will produce new knowledge and produce more publications for you. So, now that you have a sense for how grants and scholarship are entangled, let's move to the goals of the RFP. Here's a set of questions on this slide that every RFP you ever write will need to address. Number one, what are we going to learn from this proposal that we didn't already know? Number two, why is it worth knowing? In other words, what significance will this have? And finally, how do we know that the findings or knowledge that comes from this project are going to be true and valid? Remember how just a few short weeks ago we talked about the idea of validation in scientific discourses? Well, in the RFP, you will be expected to show how the project will meet the expectations of the overall scientific community. These three questions are going to guide you in how to focus, prepare, and design your RFP so that you provide something new, show why it's important, and validate it appropriately. This is your audience, a group of people who want to know the answers to these questions as quickly and easily as possible, and who will give you money if you convince them. That's one of the biggest things to remember about writing an RFP. It is explicitly persuasive, whereas your literature review only demonstrated ethos and logos through the transmission and synthesis of information. For the RFP, you are making an argument as to why this research is valid and important and should be funded. So, who are you persuading? Because the RFP is necessarily a persuasive genre, let's spend some time talking about this audience. First of all, as I've mentioned, your audience has money to give. They want to give it, but they are going to be skeptical about giving it to you. We already went over the questions your audience is going to have in mind while they're considering your proposal. Is it new? Is it important? Is it valid or possible? Your audience's predisposition towards you in asking these questions is going to be automatically that your research isn't new, that it's not important, and that your design isn't a good way of validating the knowledge that comes from your project. This isn't meant to scare you. Just keep in mind that these are the 3 points on which you're going to have to prove yourself very clearly. These are the gates, and your audience is the gatekeepers that you're going to have to pass through. Something else you need to know about your audience, that they are educated enough to be able to ask these questions and determine whether your answers are good enough. They are likely researchers of some kind, but for the most part, they will be researchers from across multiple disciplines, unless you're applying for a specific grant in your field. So this means that your answers to these questions need to demonstrate your expertise in your discipline, but communicate your ideas for a more general audience of scientists. You'll have to do a bit of juggling between your disciplinary expertise and more accessible communication. Some nuts and bolts about proposals before we dive into the actual processes you'll need to undergo to design an effective project. The different kinds of proposals you might encounter and the typical sections of a proposal. So first, there are such things as solicited and unsolicited proposals. Your department or lab might solicit a proposal directly from you, or colleagues might be collecting proposals and want to hear directly from you. More often in your early career, though, you'll be sending out unsolicited proposals, meaning the person on the receiving end isn't expecting something from you. You might be submitting a proposal to a funding agency like the National Science Foundation, National Institute for Health, National Endowment for the Humanities, or the Center for Disease Control. Often these are government agencies, but you'll find nonprofits and think tanks also put out calls for proposal funding. So this is what you'll be doing in this course, a proposal to the funding agency on campus, the NC State Office of Undergraduate Research. Other kinds of proposals might be if your department needs to get a project approved, for example, with dissertation research in graduate school. This is a document called a prospectus, and it lays out the timeline and details of your dissertation research. You might also write a proposal to use the resources of a specific research facility. An example of this on campus is the incubator, and this is on Centennial campus. In order to use their makerspace, as far as I'm aware, they also have a network of professionals they offer. Students have to propose a business idea or a prototype in order to access those things. So there's a lot of other instances where you might write a proposal, but those are the most common. So now the parts of a proposal are also going to differ from proposal to proposal, but in general, you're going to be submitting an abstract, which summarizes everything, a section in which you define the purpose, objectives, and significance of the proposal, a section reviewing relevant literature and the questions you'll specifically be asking, and the method section, which details your research design, how you're going to test the ideas you're interested in exploring. And finally, you will likely create a budget if you're proposing to a funding agency, and will most often have to provide a timeline for finishing the project. Basically, agencies want to know that you're going to finish in a timely manner and not be a financial drain on them. So let's talk about the individual components or the sections of the RFP. Again, these may vary from proposal to proposal, but largely you'll begin an RFP with a purposes and objectives section. This functions essentially like an introduction. You'll want to introduce the topic and why it's an important topic of study. You'll also want to briefly summarize the scholarship that you're drawing from and identify the gap question or the problem that stems from that literature and that motivates this study. You'll then explicitly state the overall purpose. This project will do X in order to do Y. Keep in mind that your purpose shouldn't be vague and one-dimensional. You should identify the objective of the project in terms of a specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, or a SMART goal. Thinking about your purpose in terms of SMART goals demonstrates that your project is well thought out and can be validated in some way, shape, or form. And finally, you'll want to preview the rest of the proposal, i.e., the method you'll be using to test the question and what you will accomplish by doing so. The purpose of this introduction, or the purposes and objectives section, is really, it's the burden of proof for your project proposal. It should aim to identify the first two questions that your reviewers are going to ask you. What am I going to learn, and why is it worth knowing? So it's in the introduction that you're going to justify the project on those terms and clearly indicate the significance of what will be your findings. The next section is your background, and really simply, the background is a literature review. It identifies the foundations and logics of thinking that bring you to your research question. Just as in your literature review for the previous assignment, the background section identifies topics and trends and cites authors who have developed work in your area of expertise. Most notably, your background section should move towards a gap in the literature and then identify your research questions. In such a way that fills that gap. In other words, you should be saying what has been said, then what is missing, and finally how your questions, your research questions, are going to fulfill that need. So with your method, I'm actually going to skip over a discussion of methods. While you have some understanding of how to craft a research question now, how to search for literature, methods are a different beast altogether. All of you are going to have different methods based on your field, but I want to save that in-depth conversation for the next lecture on methodology. For now, just know that you're going to need to dedicate some part of your proposal to describing how you will answer your research question and answering the third question that reviewers will pose to your proposal. How do we know it's true? How can we validate it? And finally, the budget and timeline for the proposal. This piece is probably the single best indicator of whether your proposal is going to be feasible. In the rest of the proposal, you've demonstrated that the project is important and will result in valid knowledge, but the budget and timeline tell your reviewers that you'll actually get done what you intend to get done. So your budget should be a clear breakdown of costs. Often the budget guidelines will leave room for you to explain resources that you're using to cut costs or department discounts. For our purposes, make sure that you include any cost-saving measures that you used. Resources on campus, space on campus, labs on campus that you already have access to. Resources that you know you have access to through the university. What this does is it demonstrates a good faith effort to stay well within the parameters of the grant funding agency. So in general, what you should include is travel, salary, equipment, and supplies, and then any inadvertent costs, mostly outsourced labor like transcription costs, lab diagnostics, cleaning services, utilities. Something to keep in mind, often grants will actually not cover travel or salaries, which are considered overhead and don't often fit into the goals of federal agencies. So the Office of Undergraduate Research, for example, which is the grant that you're going to be proposing to, this office has separate grants for travel and actually will not fund salary or stipends. So keep that in mind, that in your budget, you will not have to account for these things because they are not covered under this specific grant. So finally, you'll want to include a timeline. Use your general understanding of time management to accomplish this. Think back to the beginning of the semester when you read about how to plan for the course. You used SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely steps to accomplish your goal. You identified already in this proposal your purpose in the introduction. So now is the time to demonstrate that that purpose is SMART by breaking down the objective into individual steps and tying them to specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely dates. So think about the end result of the proposal, the needs that your method and design dictate, and cut that process down into smaller steps. Be very sure that your timeline is measurable. This is going to demonstrate to the granting agencies that you not only can accomplish your goals, but have an easy and built-in accountability system for yourself. So this may seem a little backwards here, but I wanted to give you an idea of what the research proposal is in general before showing you how to approach the project in your specific groups. So in general, I have grouped you according to the literature reviews you wrote for the previous assignment and your career goals that you've written about in your blogs. This means that some portion of your background section should already be written, or at least thought through. What your job as a team is going to be is to formulate a question directly from your collective literature reviews. Remember, the gap in the literature is your avenue into producing new knowledge, so begin there. When you put all of the literature that all of you had gathered together over the past 2 weeks, what do you see is missing? How can you formulate that into a question that can be answered within an academic year, and also with $1,000 as the Office of Undergraduate Research Grant stipulates? This will require a little bit of negotiation between your team members and might prompt you to look for some more literature to help back up your justification for the proposed project. Be prepared for your group's question to not exactly fit into any one's individual field. It should be interdisciplinary and draw from multiple bodies of literature because there's multiple disciplines present in the group. If one team member has looked at protein synthesis, for example, another has addressed animal conservation, figure out where the overlaps there are. What questions stem from putting these two questions or these two bodies of literature together? What is the missing link between them? So that's how you're going to move from lit review, individual lit reviews, to a research question that you all can address. With that, let's go ahead and end with talking about collaboration and what you should expect from working together. Because this is necessarily an interdisciplinary project, the questions you ask will come from the multiple disciplines of your team members. You need to keep in mind that no team members are more or less expert than the others. Be prepared to accommodate the views and content knowledges of your other team members, as the success of the proposal is going to depend on your ability to synthesize those different bodies of knowledge in order to produce a new research question and a design. While all team members should have equal standing, that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be clearly defined roles. I've suggested a few to you in the team member profile / workflow documents. A principal investigator, a lab director, a lab tech, and a SciComm expert. Each of these have their own responsibilities and skills that aren't necessarily tied to subject matter, but rather to work processes. So for example, the PI is the leader. The lab director is good at research. The lab tech is someone who is good at executing and carrying out tasks. And the science communicator is good at communicating and organizing information. You may not use these particular roles or even find them useful, but definitely spend some time figuring out what everyone is good at and how you're going to make work equitable for your group. You are more likely to succeed as a group if each person recognizes what they're supposed to do, whatever that may look like. So that's some general advice in working with your groups, but how do you actually make things equitable? Like, what are the steps to making things equitable? How do you make sure that everyone has heard that the project you're producing is the result of an effective and equal distribution of knowledge and work? How do you make it so that all team members have a stake in the RFP so that everyone is invested? These tips listed here come from Chelsea Troy, who is a software engineer who writes about civic responsibility in the workplace. She proposes a few steps for maintaining inclusivity when working on a team. The first is moderation. Your PI and lab directors should be looking for who is contributing and who is listening. Take it as your responsibility to know when to contribute and also when to listen to other perspectives. Both of these can be opportunities for you to learn and help your team produce something pretty incredible. So similarly, make sure that there is someone who isn't contributing. Make sure if there is someone who isn't contributing, that you give them an opportunity to do so. It may be that someone doesn't feel comfortable contributing with everyone else around. So try to find different ways to solicit their contributions if that's the case. Troy actually suggests having a deliberate strategy for attributing credit for ideas. Make sure that even in informal conversations with your team, that you're making sure that what you are saying is being attributed to the right person, something you read, a researcher, or especially another team member if you heard them talking outside the meeting, or if they contributed an idea but it wasn't immediately received. give credit to them. Make sure that you're also operating with advanced assumptions about all team members. Everyone is as smart and as reasonable as you are in this process, especially given that your job is to find common ground across your disciplinary interests. There's not going to be one of you who is more expert than the others. You all kind of have a small piece of the project that you know fully about. And so that leads me to our final criteria for equitable teamwork, making room for alternative perspectives. This doesn't just mean making sure everyone has room to talk. That's not meaningful inclusivity. That's not meaningful equitability. It means accounting for all perspectives in the solutions you create. So where is the shared ground between everyone's perspective? What solution would mean that every single person sees their ideas at work and can feel invested in the project? So with that, here's some of the resources I've cited in the presentation. Feel free to take a look at that, the blog post from Chelsea Troy. I'll be following up this video lecture with a lecture on methodology, and I will see you then.